It's one thing to fight a war in the jungle. It's another to fight it beneath one. Picture a man on his hands and knees in pitch darkness, a flashlight clamped between his teeth, sweat burning his eyes. Every breath tastes of earth, mold, and fear. His pistol rattles quietly in his grip. The air is so thick it feels alive, pressing against his face as he crawls forward. He's a soldier, sure, but down here, he's something else. He's a trespasser in someone else's kingdom. Welcome to Vietnam's underworld, where daylight meant nothing and courage had to fit into a tunnel 2 feet wide. The Americans didn't invent the term tunnel rat. The Viet Cong did, indirectly, by forcing them to become one. The VC were masters of disappearing. They built whole towns beneath the soil, hospitals, kitchens, barracks, weapons factories, hidden just under the boots of the people trying to destroy them. A man could walk over an entire regiment and never know it was there. At Cu Chi, northwest of Saigon, the ground itself was alive. The moment US troops realized that, the war stopped being two-dimensional. Early on, nobody wanted to believe it. The French had warned about these tunnels back in the 50s, but most American commanders treated it like a curiosity. Another strange Vietnamese thing, like the weather or the language. But then patrols started finding holes that led to nowhere, or worse, to somewhere they didn't want to go. A soldier would toss a grenade down one and hear nothing. No explosion, no echo, just the sound of the earth swallowing it whole. That's when it hit them. The enemy was living underground. So naturally, the brass decided somebody needed to go in and check. Not a team, not a machine, a man. Because in 1966, there was no drone small enough, no robot brave enough, and no officer stupid enough. They needed volunteers. They needed people willing to crawl into a space smaller than a coffin, where every inch could kill you. The first volunteers came from infantry units, curious, fearless, or too new to know better. The job description was simple. Find out what's down there. The training manual didn't exist yet. The equipment list was short. A .45 pistol, a flashlight, and a knife. Some men added a rope. A few carried revolvers instead of automatics because the report of a .45 could rupture eardrums inside a tunnel. When you fired, the shockwave bounced back and knocked your breath out. The smart ones carried a silenced .22. Quiet, reliable, and lethal enough at arm's length. The first time a soldier dropped into a tunnel, it was like descending into another planet. No light, no sound except a drip of water and the scuttle of rats. The walls were slick clay, the air barely breathable. Every few feet the tunnel bent sharply, not by accident but design. To slow pursuit, to break line of sight. A wrong turn could end in a dead end or a tripwire. Some passages were rigged with grenades, others narrowed so suddenly a man could get stuck. The Viet Cong made sure of it. They'd spent years perfecting their maze, sometimes digging 3 to 4 levels deep. They built trapdoors sealed so tight that bombing raids passed unnoticed above. To the men who went down there, time stopped meaning anything. Minutes felt like hours. The flashlight beam showed only a few feet ahead, and that was plenty. Some crawled on their bellies through mud and human waste. Some found the body of the last guy who tried. Others found cooking pots still warm, proof that the enemy had just slipped away. And sometimes they didn't slip away at all. When you met someone down there wasn't time for questions. You fired or you died. A tunnel firefight wasn't cinematic. It was blind, deafening, and over in seconds. The noise had nowhere to go, neither did the blood. Above the ground, the jungle might have been full of chaos, but it was open. There was sky, there was space to run. Down below, there was only the earth closing in around you. The tunnel rat's heartbeat was his only soundtrack. The smell of cordite, sweat, and fear mixed into one. When they surfaced, gasping and filthy, they looked like men reborn. Their comrades didn't cheer, they just stared. Nobody envied them. Nobody volunteered twice if they could help it. Still, the job had to be done. The tunnels held intelligence, weapons, sometimes whole command centers. Without clearing them, the war above ground was pointless. And so, in the quiet corners of the Vietnam War, a handful of men became specialists in darkness. They learned how to read the earth, how to feel for air currents that hinted at hidden chambers, how to move silently in a space where a single cough could give you away. They called them tunnel rats. The nickname wasn't meant as an insult. It was respect laced with disbelief, because only a rat could live down there and come back out alive. The Army never had a formal medal for it. Courage was measured in inches, one crawl at a time, one breath at a time. And in the darkness, those men fought a private war that most Americans would never hear about, much less understand. They didn't look like Hollywood soldiers. No gleaming helmets, no thousand-yard stares framed by golden light. Most of the men who crawled into the earth in Vietnam were short, wiry, and scrappy. The kind of guys who could squeeze through an air duct or fit under the hood of a car. If you were over 5'8", you weren't the ideal candidate. The smaller you were, the more room you had to live or die in the dark. Nobody put out a recruitment poster that said, "Volunteers needed, must enjoy tight spaces and terror." Sometimes they asked for volunteers. Sometimes they didn't bother. Commanders would just look for the smallest guy in the platoon and tell him, "Congratulations, he'd just been promoted to tunnel rat." The only thing they offered in return was a pat on the back and the hope that he'd make it out again. Training was non-existent. There were no manuals, no classes, no simulator. The first lesson came the moment you slid feet first into a hole that smelled like damp clay and smoke. You learned as you went. What worked was kept. What didn't got someone killed. The first tunnel rats improvised everything. They cut the lenses on their flashlights so the beam wouldn't give them away, tied strings around grenades to use them as early trip alarms, and learned to tap walls lightly before moving forward. If the echo changed, there was probably a chamber ahead. They didn't wear body armor because armor made you too big. They didn't carry rifles because rifles couldn't fit. Their world was measured in inches, not yards. Each man developed his own ritual before going in. Some muttered prayers, some made crude jokes, others just lit a cigarette and stared into the dark until their pulse slowed enough to start moving. A few scratched their initials near the entrance so somebody would know who they were if they didn't come back. Officially, their mission was reconnaissance. Find maps, supplies, and documents. Locate tunnel entrances. Identify weapons caches. Capture prisoners when possible. In practice, it was often survival and improvisation. The moment you were underground, there were no rules, no radio contact, and no backup. The Viet Cong had built the tunnels as both shelter and weapon. They used bamboo spikes, spring-loaded traps, and sometimes poisonous snakes tied behind hidden panels. Every corner was a question. Was this the way out, or the last thing you'd ever see? It took a special mindset to volunteer twice. Some men described it as kind of an addiction. Fear so pure it became fuel. Others said it was duty, or the need to protect the men above ground. A few admitted it was pride. Being a tunnel rat gave you status, even if nobody outside your unit knew it. The infantry respected you because you were doing the one job everyone else avoided. The brass ignored you because your work didn't fit into the body count spreadsheets they loved so much. They were mostly infantrymen, but some engineers and MPs got pulled in. They came from every background. Farm kids, city punks, a few college dropouts who'd gone looking for adventure and found hell instead. What they had in common was nerve. You couldn't fake it down there. The claustrophobia, the silence, the smell, it stripped you bare. Whatever kind of man you were on the surface, the tunnel would show it. Stories circulated through the ranks. One man found himself face to face with a Viet Cong soldier in total darkness. Both fired, missed, and clawed at each other until one knife found flesh. Another stumbled into a storage room full of munitions and realized that a single spark would turn it into a furnace. Some men described hearing whispers or footsteps that never belonged to anyone. In the blackness, imagination was an enemy almost as deadly as the VC. There were no promotions or medals that made sense for what they did. Official reports used dry language. Tunnel cleared. Documents recovered. What those words left out were the hours of crawling through filth, the heartbeat of a grenade fuse somewhere ahead, the feeling of air changing just before a trap door opened. When they surfaced, blinking into the sun, the world above felt unreal. Too bright, too loud, too clean. They developed their own kind of gallows humor. They'd call the tunnels Charlie's Subway or the Coochie Hilton. They joked about getting frequent crawling miles. Laughter was armor. It was how you kept from going insane. Because every time you went down, you knew it could be the last. There's a photograph from 1968, one of those grainy black and white shots that doesn't need words. A shirtless soldier crouches at the mouth of a tunnel, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. A look that's half determined and half resigned. That face became the unofficial emblem of the tunnel rats. No medals, no speeches, just a man about to disappear into the dirt because someone had to. Above ground, the war was politics and headlines. Below, it was silence and instinct. And down there, the tunnel rat was king of a kingdom no one wanted. The tunnels weren't just holes in the ground. They were architecture. Primitive, brilliant, and viciously effective. The Viet Cong turned soil into strategy, carving an invisible empire beneath the feet of armies with satellites, napalm, and helicopters. To an American soldier standing above, it looked like nothing, just a patch of jungle or a termite mound. But underneath could be 3 stories of rooms, passages, and traps that had been dug and rebuilt since the days of the French. They started small, a place to hide a rifle or a handful of rice. But the longer the war dragged on, the deeper they went. By the mid-1960s, the Cu Chi district alone had more than 150 miles of interconnected tunnels. Imagine a subway system built with shovels and bare hands. Hospitals with operating tables cut from bamboo. Sleeping quarters the size of closets. Vent shafts disguised as anthills. They even had meeting halls and printing presses. In some sectors, a man could walk a mile underground without ever seeing daylight. Every feature had a purpose. The twist in a passage wasn't random. It was meant to deflect shock waves from explosions. Vertical shafts forced anyone entering to expose their torso first. Narrow choke points slowed pursuit and funneled intruders into kill zones. When U.S. engineers later mapped them, they realized the tunnels were masterpieces of low-tech engineering. They drained water with clay traps, vented smoke through hidden chimneys, and used termite mounds to mask exits. The air was stale but breathable. The VC could stay underground for weeks. To the men sent down there, those same designs were torture. The heat was suffocating, oxygen thinned quickly, turning every breath into a labor. Flashlights fogged from humidity, the floor squished with mud, sometimes worse. Rats and centipedes thrived in the dark. Bats hung like black fruit from the ceiling until a stray noise sent them shrieking into your face. You didn't have the luxury of flinching. Your hands were full, and the wrong twitch could set off a tripwire. Booby traps were everywhere. Grenades wired to bamboo stakes. Nails dipped in excrement to cause infection. Boards studded with sharpened spikes angled to catch you coming or going. Some tunnels had false floors that collapsed into pits. Others used swinging logs studded with blades. There were even stories of venomous snakes tied behind concealed panels, trained, if that's the right word, to lash out when disturbed. Whether every story was true didn't matter. Down there, the fear was real enough. The noise was strange too. Every sound carried differently underground. The scrape of a boot sole sounded like thunder. Your own heartbeat echoed in your ears. Some men said they could hear the tunnels breathe, the faint rush of air through hidden vents, a reminder that somewhere nearby, someone else was alive and listening. Americans tried every method to destroy them. Bulldozers, explosives, napalm, even flooding. But the tunnels always came back. They were patched, rerouted, extended. You could bomb a village flat in the morning, and by nightfall see smoke drifting from the same ground. It was like fighting an enemy that lived inside the planet itself. There were specialized units formed to tackle them. Tunnel clearing teams, made up of a few volunteers and whatever engineers they could borrow. They experimented with everything from tear gas to trained dogs, but nothing worked as well as one man with a gun and nerve. Sometimes they'd pump water in to flush the enemy out, only to discover the tunnel sloped upward and the water just drained into another chamber. Fire didn't travel far in the damp clay. Explosives caved sections in, but the rest held firm. The earth always won. The men who crawled through these networks often described an eerie stillness, like being inside the lungs of the war itself. Above, artillery shook the jungle. Below, it was quiet, except for dripping water and the shuffle of things that lived without light. Time blurred. The difference between a few feet and a few miles was measured only by terror. What made the tunnels terrifying wasn't just their design, but what they represented. The Viet Cong didn't need air support or armor. They had patience and dirt. Every shovelful said the same thing. You might own the sky, but we own the ground. When a tunnel rat finally broke through into a chamber, after crawling for what felt like forever, he might find a kitchen still warm, or a small underground classroom, or sometimes nothing but silence and the stench of abandonment. The realization hit hard. You weren't just fighting soldiers down here, you were invading homes, sanctuaries, and graves all at once. Each discovery told the same story, that the war wasn't confined to the visible world. The jungle was just a mask. The real fight was buried underneath, in spaces so small that even courage had to crawl. By the time Hollywood got around to telling the story of the tunnel rats, it had already polished the dirt off the truth. In the movies, darkness is just a lighting problem. Down there it was an enemy. But that never stopped the studios from giving it a glossy coat of heroism and a soundtrack. On screen, the tunnel rat is a flawless archetype. Muscles glistening, breathing steady, crawling through perfectly spaced corridors that somehow never smell like death or decay. The flashlight beam is cinematic, not blinding. Every bullet hits its mark. The air is thick with tension, but never with rot. In The Green Berets, John Wayne's men talk about bravery like it's a choice you make after breakfast. In Platoon, the tunnels are a brief detour, not the main event. And in Uwe Boll's Tunnel Rats, a movie so detached from reality it might as well have been filmed on Mars, every soldier looks like they were cast for a fitness commercial. But the real tunnel rats weren't built for the big screen. They were built for survival. They didn't crawl into cinematic suspense. They crawled into sewage, mud, and fear. They didn't deliver one-liners. They grunted, cursed, and prayed. When their flashlights failed, they felt their way forward with their fingertips. When a gun went off, the shockwave was like getting punched in the chest by the earth itself. Hollywood loves symmetry, the kind of courage that fits neatly between plot points. Real tunnel rats didn't have that luxury. There were no crescendos, no triumphant music when they emerged. Sometimes they just sat on the ground afterward, shaking, covered in filth, trying to breathe air that didn't taste like clay. The movies made them legends. Reality made them survivors. It's not that the filmmakers didn't try to honor them. It's that no camera can capture the claustrophobia of being sealed inside a hole where death is close enough to smell. In a movie theater, you can walk out when it gets too tense. In Vietnam, you couldn't even stand up. What the films miss most is the silence. Down there was no yelling, no chatter, no radio static. Just the scraping of boots and the slow drip of water. You didn't get sweeping shots of explosions or choreographed firefights. A real tunnel fight happened at a distance of 2 feet in total darkness between men who never saw each other's faces. It was sudden, brutal, and over in seconds. There was no dramatic pause for reflection, just an instinctive reaction, a flash of light, and the smell of cordite. But America needed its myths. By the late 1970s and 80s, audiences were exhausted with the Vietnam story as tragedy. They wanted redemption, something clean and cinematic. So the tunnel rat became another symbol of rugged heroism, the lone warrior who dared to go where others wouldn't. It made for good storytelling, just not accurate storytelling. There's a kind of irony there. The tunnel rat's real courage came from anonymity. They didn't go down for fame or glory. They went down because someone had to. They didn't even get special pay, let alone recognition. Most went home to silence. No medals, no parades, no movie deals. Many didn't talk about it for decades. Meanwhile, Hollywood turned their terror into entertainment, the same way it turns every ugly truth into something palatable enough to sell popcorn. You can't really blame the filmmakers. It's almost impossible to make audiences feel what those men felt without losing them entirely. There's no narrative payoff in panic attacks or claustrophobia. So the screen traded fear for spectacle. It gave the tunnel rats uniforms that stayed clean, flashlights that never died, and enemies who always waited politely to be shot on cue. The reality, the sudden ambushes, the blind firing, the quiet aftermath, was too small, too personal, too human. Still, something in those films resonates, even if it's wrong. Maybe it's the idea that courage exists in the smallest spaces, that sometimes the greatest battles happen where no one's watching, that underneath all the myth-making, there's still a grain of truth buried in the mud. Because while Hollywood might have sanitized the tunnels, the men who crawled through them didn't need a script. They already lived the horror show. If you asked one of them what it was really like, he probably wouldn't quote a movie line. He'd shrug, take a drag of his cigarette, and tell you it was tight, hot, and loud. Then he'd go quiet, because there aren't words for the rest. And that's the part Hollywood will never get right, the silence afterward. The kind of silence that doesn't fade when the credits roll. When tunnel rats came back up to the surface, they looked like ghosts climbing out of the grave. Their eyes adjusted slowly to sunlight, their clothes soaked through with sweat, sometimes blood, always mud. The jungle around them felt unreal, too open, too bright. Every sound felt too loud. The world above seemed like a dream someone else was having. You could tell who'd just come up by the way they moved. Slow, cautious, blinking like men who didn't quite believe in daylight anymore. There was no decompression period, no welcome back. You got a canteen, maybe a smoke, and went right back to whatever the war was doing topside. If you looked shaken, no one asked. What could you possibly say? I found a classroom under a rice paddy. I shot a man 3 feet away and never saw his face. The vocabulary for that kind of experience didn't exist. It still doesn't. Some men could handle it for a while. Some couldn't. The tunnels didn't just squeeze your body. They compressed your mind. Claustrophobia hit even the tough ones. A few refused to go back in after a bad run. Nobody blamed them. Others went back too often. They started to crave it. The quiet, the focus, the strange purity of it. Down there, the world made sense. Up above, everything was noise and politics. Underground, there was only you and survival. That kind of isolation leaves a mark. When the war ended, most tunnel rats didn't talk about it. They came home to a country that didn't want to hear about Vietnam, let alone the men who fought in the dirt under it. The public remembered helicopter gunships and protest marches, not the handful of soldiers who crawled through the earth like miners hunting ghosts. The few who did try to tell their stories were usually met with blank stares or disbelief. You went where? Nightmares were common, so were sudden flashes of panic. Crowded elevators, basements, even the act of closing a door could trigger memories from those tight spaces. The VA didn't have a category for it back then. The phrase post-traumatic stress disorder hadn't even entered official vocabulary yet. They called it nerves, as if it were just something you could sleep off. But if the tunnel broke them, they also bonded them. The rats formed their own strange fraternity, a brotherhood of men who could recognize each other by the 1,000-yard crawl, that slightly hunched posture of someone who'd spent too much time below ground. They didn't need to talk about it, they just knew. When one walked into a reunion years later, the others could see it in his eyes. The unspoken understanding. You went down there too. They developed nicknames for each other, half insult, half badge of honor. They laughed about things no one else found funny. They told stories with punchlines that ended in explosions or blood because humor was the only way to make the memories survivable. You hear about the guy who shot a snake and hit a claymore instead? Someone would say. Everyone would laugh because not laughing would mean remembering too clearly how easily it could have been them. Some found redemption in talking to historians or in writing memoirs decades later when the nightmares had dulled into history. Others never spoke of it again. They worked jobs, raised families, and avoided small spaces. A few drank too much, trying to drown the feeling that they were still underground. You can't blame them. The tunnels didn't just end when the war did. They followed them home. Inside those tunnels, fear was constant, but so was trust. When a man went down, the ones above guarded that hole like it was sacred ground. They counted the minutes, listening for movement, praying they'd see his head reappear. That bond was different from the camaraderie of a squad or platoon. It was rawer, quieter, almost primal. You were literally betting your life that someone else wouldn't panic. And when they did come out, alive, covered in grime and stinking of earth, there was no cheering, just a few silent nods, maybe a muttered welcome back. That was enough, because down there, respect didn't come from rank or medals, it came from survival. Years later, some of those men found each other again, at veterans events or by accident in VA waiting rooms. They'd shake hands and smile like old classmates at a reunion. But behind the smiles, there was a shared secret. They'd both seen the underside of the war. They'd been in a place so dark and small that it stripped everything human down to instinct. And somehow, they'd crawl back into the light. The movies could show soldiers fighting the enemy, but these men had fought something harder to name. They'd fought darkness itself and carried a piece of it home. When the war finally ended, the tunnels didn't. The jungles began to swallow them again, as it always had. Entrances collapsed, maps vanished, and rain filled what was left with mud and silence. The Americans left, the cameras stopped rolling, and time did what time always does. It buried everything. But the stories of the tunnel rats refused to stay underground. For years, their legacy lived mostly in rumor and myth. Veterans halls whispered about them, and historians wrote paragraphs instead of chapters. The Army didn't hand out medals for crawling through nightmares. There was no glamorous after-action report for a man who spent his day face-to-face with the earth. But slowly, the legend grew. Not the Hollywood kind with chiseled jaws and orchestral music. The real kind, the quiet legend of men who faced something the rest of the world pretended didn't exist. In time, their work found new relevance. When modern armies began preparing for urban warfare, they realized something. Cities have tunnels too. Subways, sewers, smuggling routes, underground networks. Different terrain, same darkness. The Pentagon began dusting off old manuals, studying after-action reports from Cu Chi and Ben Catt. They found that every inch of modern doctrine for subterranean warfare, every training course, and every scenario owed something to the tunnel rats. Those men had written the book, even if nobody thought to publish it at the time. The Israelis studied them after fighting in Gaza's tunnels. The U.S. Army reintroduced tunnel warfare training in the 2000s, this time with sensors, robots, and drones. But the core lesson hadn't changed. Technology helps, but courage still has to fit in tight spaces. The rats of Vietnam didn't have drones or night vision. They had flashlights, instinct, and guts. Everything learned since is just an echo of what they did first, alone, underground. The Vietnamese, too, preserve parts of their tunnels as museums. Tourists can walk through widened replicas of Cu Chi's network today, ducking politely for photo ops and emerging 5 minutes later into the sunlight. It's easy to forget those tunnels once swallowed entire platoons. What's left now is sanitized, safe, well-lit, full of souvenir stands. But even there, if you stop talking long enough, you can still feel the weight of it. The air stays heavy, the walls seem to breathe. The ghosts are polite, but they're still there. What's strange about the tunnel rat story is how quietly it fits into the broader narrative of Vietnam. It's a war remembered for chaos, politics, protests, and body counts. But beneath all that noise, the rats fought a war of inches, unseen, uncelebrated, and unforgettable. They didn't win territory or raise flags. They cleared darkness. That was their job, to make the ground safe for the men above, one crawl at a time. When you talk to one today, if you're lucky enough to find one, they'll usually downplay it. Just doing my job, they'll say. They won't mention the smell or the heat or the way the world feels smaller after something like that. They don't call themselves heroes. Most never did. They'll joke that the real rats were smarter. They could run both ways. But history has started to catch up. Documentaries, oral histories, and books have begun peeling back the myths, showing the men behind the legend. They weren't commandos or super soldiers. They were just ordinary grunts thrown into extraordinary circumstances, armed with a pistol, a light, and a stubborn refusal to die in the dark. And that's the part that deserves to be remembered, the part that can't be dramatized. Because in the end, their story isn't about glory, it's about endurance, about what happens when courage has nowhere to go. The tunnel stripped everything away: rank, fear, pride, even hope. What was left was the purest form of survival a soldier can know. The war above ended in chaos. The one below ended quietly, in the same silence it began. But the men who fought it left behind lessons that still matter, that courage isn't loud, that real war is fought where no one can see it, and that sometimes the hardest battles happen inches from your face in the dark. Hollywood gave us heroes with perfect lighting and neat endings. The real tunnel rats never got either. They got out, most of them anyway, and went home, carrying the weight of the earth in their lungs and the echoes of silence in their heads. They didn't need statues or speeches. The dirt itself remembers them. And if you ever find yourself in one of those preserved tunnels of Vietnam, crouching low, flashlight shaking a little in your hand, remember this: for a few men 50 years ago, this was no exhibit. It was the edge of hell, and they went in anyway. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave, you